So I think that's a very vivid example there of how Hindu nationalism certainly can be politically advantageous for Modi because a lot of people would support it. But for the large number of Indians that are most concerned about these bread and butter issues, that agenda is going to do nothing to make them more comfortable with Modi or make them want to vote for him again.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. India's election was supposed to be something of a coronation for Narendra Modi. Instead, he got a comeuppance. India is, of course, the world's largest democracy, and after nearly a month-long election season, the final results were declared in early June. Narendra Modi and his political party, the BJP, fared much worse than expected. They secured far fewer seats in the Lok Sabha, the parliament, than expected, and now Modi and the BJP will have to form a coalition government after they lost an outright majority. On the line to discuss the election results and what it means for Indian politics and foreign policy going forward is Michael Kugelman, director of the Wilson Center's South Asia Institute and also the deputy director of the Wilson Center's new Indo-Pacific program. As Michael Kugelman explains, the outcome of this election suggests a growing skepticism among the Indian public of Modi's brand of Hindu nationalism and the authoritarian tendencies that he's embraced. So by now you might have heard that we are launching a new podcast. It's called To Save Us From Hell. Each week, co-host Anjali Dayal and I will discuss the latest news and happenings from around the United Nations. I am really, really excited about this new show. I have not launched a new podcast since I started Global Dispatches over a decade ago. This new show is going to be a hit. There is nothing like it out there. I can't wait to share it with you all. To Save Us From Hell is going to be crowdfunded via Substack. I would love your early support as we get this new show off the ground. Please visit globaldispatches.org and get a paid subscription to help us with our launch. I so appreciate it. You can follow the links in the show notes of this episode for access to Save Us From Hell at a discounted rate. Thank you. Now here is my conversation with Michael Kugelman of the Wilson Center. So we are speaking just a couple days after the end of a long election season in India. Going into these elections, there were such high expectations for Narendra Modi and the BJP. Why were these expectations so high to begin with?
Well, first of all, Modi himself had boasted that his alliance, which is known by its acronym NDA, the BJP-led alliance, could get about 400 seats in the parliament out of 543 altogether. And that would have been significantly more than his alliance got in the 2019 election when it won in the landslide. It got about 350 seats. But Modi was saying that, we can get 400, we can do that. I would also argue that the expectations were high just because the BJP, Modi's party, has had such a remarkable track record of success in the Modi era. When he first became prime minister in the 2014 elections, he won in a landslide. Then in 2019, he was reelected in a landslide, even better than he did in 2014. Even going back to his days as chief minister in the state of Gujarat before he was prime minister, he never lost an election. He always did very well. So I think that the boast and the supreme confidence of Modi and the BJP, coupled with the fact that they have actually indeed had a very successful track record with electoral politics, Those things combine to generate these types of large expectations, though, of course, and I know we'll discuss this, well before the election happened, many observers and analysts were saying, well, maybe we shouldn't have such high expectations because we may not necessarily see such a successful BJP outcome this time.
So it turns out these elections really did pierce that aura of invincibility that you just described. Can you just break down some of the key election results and what happened?
I mean, the first thing I'm going to talk about how, the big storyline here is that the BJP suffered a major setback. It didn't do anywhere as near as it had wanted to do and as many as thought it would do. But, keeping in mind the proper context, the BJP still won more seats by far than any other party. It was head and shoulders above any other party. That's the first thing to keep in mind. Also, because it won more seats than any other party, it was in a position to form a governing alliance, a governing coalition with its electoral alliance partners, and it's going to make history. The BJP and Modi will be in power for 3 straight terms. And you have to go back to India's independence hero, Nehru, to last come back to an example, really the only other example, where you had someone that governed for 3 terms. So I think it's important to keep that context in mind. But what happened in this election? What are some of the results? Well, the BJP, it was really a disappointing result in the sense that it did not get enough seats to win a majority. You have to win 272 seats in India's parliament to have a majority and be able to govern the country without any coalition partner. This, of course, is a parliamentary democracy, very different from the types of democracy that we have in the United States. At any rate, it did not get that majority. It didn't come close, but it was able to get a majority because of the seats that were won by its election alliance partners. There are about 8 or 9 of them. And there were 2 of them in particular that each got about 7 or 8 seats. And then you had a bunch of others that each got 1 or 2 seats here and there. But even when you put together all the seats won by the entire BJP-led alliance, it was still below 300 seats. I think the final total was about 293 seats. Keeping in mind that Modi had vowed to get 400 seats altogether. Well, he failed by more than 100, and I think that's pretty significant. And if you look across the country, if you look on state levels, there were some really big shockers. And I would argue that the biggest surprise of all in this election came in the state of Uttar Pradesh. This is the most populous state in India, which makes it a huge electoral prize, sort of like a California of Indian politics, so to speak. So it's a very populous state. You have quite a few seats that are contested there for the Lok Sabha, the parliament in New Delhi. This is a state that has been a BJP bastion for many years. One of the most senior, most popular BJP leaders other than Modi, a guy named Yogi Adityanath, who is, quite frankly, an extremist, a very hardline guy. He's the chief minister there, which is basically like a governor in the U.S. He's been in that role for quite some time, quite popular. It was in Uttar Pradesh where earlier this year, Narendra Modi inaugurated a controversial new Hindu temple, which had been one of his big priorities attached to his Hindu nationalist agenda for many years. So this is Uttar Pradesh. Many people, if not just about everyone observing the election, thought that the BJP would do very well there, but in fact it did not. It only received the second highest number of seats. One of the parties in the opposition alliance got the most seats, and that was just a real shocker.
Well, why is that? Like, what do you think accounts for the diminished results for the BJP? Like, is there exit polling or anything to suggest why it is that voters in Uttar Pradesh turned against the BJP?
Yeah, so I mean, here's the funny thing. There were exit polls for sure. India frequently has exit polls that are released a few days before the election results are announced. So results were announced on a Tuesday. The exit polls came out the Sunday before. Just about every exit poll that was out there predicted that the BJP alliance would win in a landslide, maybe even getting more seats than it did in 2019. But the funny thing is that exit polls are notoriously wrong. They don't do a good job of predicting things in India. But, there were a few exit poll companies that have been pretty close in their estimates. And even they were predicting that the BJP would do much better than it ended up doing. So you can't look to the exit polls as a predictor of what would happen. In terms of your question, why did we see the results that we did? There are a number of factors. One, quite frankly, is economic stress. We hear so much about India's economic growth story, but inflation and in particular unemployment have persisted across India, including in many states that have been bastions of the BJP for a long time. And youth unemployment is a particularly big issue. India is a very young country demographically, which means that, of India's nearly 1 billion voters, a significant component of them are young people. So that was definitely a factor. Another, I would argue, is a pushback or really backlash against Modi's Hindu nationalism, his core ideology, as well as the repressive tactics that his government used during its first decade in power. But then I would also highlight something that's a bit more difficult to pin down, but it's important to note anyway. And it's what in India people describe as anti incumbency, this
Mm.
idea of not wanting to bring back the same person again. He's been in power for 10 years, and he's not the only Indian prime minister to be in power for 10 years, but that's a long time. And I would argue that many in India felt that he was losing a lot of his shine, that he had lost his ability to connect with the masses in ways that he had during his first few years in power. So I think that many in India were simply ready for a change. Finally, I think we need to give credit to the opposition, which many observers and analysts had left for dead, had done very little in national politics for many years. There's an alliance that it formed called the India Alliance some time ago, but it consisted of a lot of parties that didn't get along, hadn't been able to come out with a leader that could actually be someone to counter Modi. But despite all that, they made some pretty savvy decisions on the campaign trail in terms of how they allotted tickets and things like that. So I think you have to give credit to the Congress. The Congress party is the lead opposition party, but
Mhm.
need to give credit to the opposition alliance on the whole for actually playing the electoral politics game quite well, despite being heavy underdogs.
I'm wondering if you put India's election results in maybe like a broader global context we're seeing in terms of anti-incumbency. Your remark just now made me think of recent election results both in South Africa and in Turkey, which, are both kind of messy democracies, much like India, but still, mature democracies. Do you see that as part of a global trend at this point?
I think so. I think there's something to be said for that. I mean, certainly, you have your dictators out there, your authoritarians that are in power for decades because they can be. They don't have elections. They don't allow the public to weigh in and have their say. And 10 years is a long time for a democratically elected leader to be in power anywhere, whether India or anywhere else. And so this is certainly a trend that we're seeing in other places, including some countries where you've also had some leaders in power for quite some time. But I think, quite frankly, it's refreshing from the perspective of democracy to see what happened in India, to see voters turn against this BJP wave, so to speak, given what's been happening in the neighborhood, so to speak, right? I mean, Pakistan and Bangladesh had elections earlier this year, and in both of those cases, you basically had the incumbent parties come back, but both of those elections were deeply flawed. In the Pakistan case, it was heavily rigged. In the Bangladesh case, the opposition boycotted it. And so it's nice to see this case in India where the incumbent comes back, but the voters sent a very strong message given what happened with the final result. So I think that's important to point out too.
So you've alluded to this a couple of times now, but since Modi was first elected in 2014, he's embraced both Hindu nationalism and has demonstrated some authoritarian tendencies. There's been some democratic backsliding. I'd be interested in having you explain how, over the years, these two trends have manifested in his time in office and whether or not you think the election results are an explicit rejection of some of the things voters have seen in terms of both an embrace of Hindu nationalism and democratic backsliding.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one could argue that, Modi is not the first Indian leader to pursue a Hindu nationalist agenda, but I would argue that he has pursued it particularly assertively, some would argue aggressively, and indeed in undemocratic ways. And this is why I think there's a connection between Hindu nationalism as pursued by Modi and new concerns about democracy. He and his government have come out with new laws and new policies that discriminate against Muslims. That's not good from the perspective of democratic principles. And of course, the Indian Muslim community is by far the largest religious minority in India. So, in terms of how voters were responding to all this, absolutely. There's good reason to believe that many voters were basically pushing back against Hindu nationalism. Now, Modi has this very large Hindu majority base. Many of them are perfectly comfortable with Hindu nationalism, some of them may have voted against him for other reasons. But I think that in many cases, Indian voters that were hurting because of high food prices, because of poverty, because of not being able to find a job, that type of thing. And I think that they look at this Hindu nationalist agenda, whether we're talking about inaugurating this new Ram temple in Uttar Pradesh, or whether we're talking about, this controversial new citizenship law, which gives non-Muslim minorities coming from neighboring countries a fast track to citizenship, or whether you're looking at Modi's policies in Kashmir to strip Jammu and Kashmir, a Muslim majority region, of its autonomy. I think that there are significant numbers of Indian voters that look at all that and say, okay, I see that, that's fine, but what does that do to put food on the table? It doesn't help me eat, it doesn't help me get a job, that type of thing. So I think that there's a bit of a disconnect there. And coming back to the Uttar Pradesh case, the constituency in the town where Modi inaugurated that temple in Ayodhya is the area there. The BJP lost that area in the election, and there's been plenty of reports of how people that live in that area where the temple was inaugurated are very poor, have been really struggling in terms of jobs. Some of them were displaced in order to allow the temple to be constructed. So I think that's a very vivid example there of how Hindu nationalism certainly can be politically advantageous for Modi because a lot of people would support it. But for the large number of Indians that are most concerned about these bread and butter issues, that agenda is going to do nothing to make them more comfortable with Modi or make them want to vote for him again.
So that's interesting. So do you expect this third term of Modi and a BJP-led alliance will, be a bit more chastened and won't be so explicitly embracing of Hindu nationalism, at least as audaciously as they have in the past?
I think that we could see obstacles for Modi in pushing out that Hindu nationalist agenda, but not because he decides he doesn't want to do it, but more so because he just is not in the position to do it. So I think that it could be more of an issue of a lack of capacity than a lack of will. Hindu nationalism is not going to go away in Modi's mind. I mean, this is the overarching ideological driver of his governance and his party's governance for that matter, and has been for quite some time. But I think that the challenge for Modi will be the coalition partners. And indeed, I mean, these are junior partners. I mean, the BJP got far more seats than any of the coalition partners, right? I mean, the two coalition partners that got the most seats, I think they each got about 7 or 8 seats, right? And the BJP got well more than 200. But you need consensus in a coalition, no matter what it looks like in a ruling coalition. It turns out that some of these coalition partners are very much uncomfortable with Hindu nationalism. And some of these junior partners have important Indian Muslim constituencies. We're talking about, regional parties. They don't have national clout, but they certainly have significance in different parts of the country. And, they're not as hardline as the BJP. So I think that this is where Modi could run into some problems. I would argue his economic reform agenda could be a problem, but I definitely think it could be more difficult for him to push this agenda out. And one of the big questions moving forward is how will he adjust to having to lead a government that is a coalition government? He's never had to do that. I mean, he's always had that luxury of his party having an absolute majority that's governed on its own. So will he be willing to conciliate a bit? Will he be willing to compromise? His politics are not cut out for those types of things, quite frankly. But if he wants to be able to advance his Hindu nationalist agenda in his third term as much as he would like, I think that there may need to be a bit of give and take with the coalition partners.
So, what's next then on the domestic political agenda for Narendra Modi? And I'll ask you a foreign policy question after, but you just alluded to this economic reform agenda. I'd be interested in hearing more about that.
So, I mean, the immediate term priorities for Modi on the political side are, of course, to select his cabinet. And, that'll be very interesting because I think it'll be an early indication of how Modi deals with the horse trading involved in coalition politics and the coalition governments. I think it's quite clear that some of the junior partners in the coalition are going to want to demand some of the key ministries, perhaps even external affairs, essentially the foreign affairs
Yeah.
minister. And if you look at the previous Modi government, some of the most recognizable figures were the likes of Jaishankar, the external affairs minister. So seeing how that works out will be very interesting. And my understanding as well is that the finance ministry, that is something that the coalition partners have their eyes on leading as well. And given the importance of economic policy, that could be pretty significant. So I think that that'll be the biggest, most immediate domestic political priority. Yeah, and I imagine that some of those cabinet positions will not be filled until well after Modi is sworn in for his third term.
And on foreign policy, do you see any changes afoot in Indian foreign policy, maybe particularly as it relates to its relationship with China? And I'll note with interest, as I'm sure you saw, there was this interesting exchange on Twitter between Lai Ching-te, the newly elected head of Taiwan, and Modi, kind of congratulating each other, which was like this kind of unique direct exchange between the Indian leader and the Taiwan leader.
Yeah, that was very telling.
And they had an audience of one in mind when they
Right.
did
Oh,
that.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So my apologies for the shameless plug, but I did publish a piece for Time magazine that looked at this very question of what will Modi's foreign policy look like in the third term. And I think the most important point to put out there is that we can talk about how it might be difficult for Modi to pursue his domestic agenda because, that's where you're going to probably have some disagreements with the coalition partners, particularly on the Hindu nationalism issue, on economic reform, and so on. But I would argue that I don't think he'll be that encumbered as he tries to push out his foreign policy, mainly because I imagine that his coalition partners will be perfectly fine with it. I mean, we're probably going to see a lot of continuity with what we did during his previous terms. And one of his major goals, which the partners will agree with, is to continue this effort to strengthen India's role on the global stage and to take it beyond just being a middle power, so to speak. But in terms of what to see with, some of the key countries, China and so on, just a few weeks ago, during the latter part of the campaign, during some of the latter phases of voting, you heard some messaging from Modi and several other officials saying that we can't have a normal relationship with China until we make more progress in resolving a border dispute. One of the reasons why India and China have all these issues in their relationship is there's a disputed border that they fought a war over back in the 60s and it still hasn't been resolved. So I think that will be a priority for Modi. I think that he's going to want to be able to show, particularly after his party was humbled in the election, he's going to want to be able to show the Indian public and others beyond India that he still has the capacity to get big things done. And so one way to do that would be to figure out some way to make the border issue less of a nuisance and less of a problem. It's not going to be easy. There have been high-level military dialogues between the two sides over the few years since there was a particularly nasty border clash in the Ladakh region. It was just about 4 years ago.
You and I did a whole episode on that
We
in the
did.
summer of
Indeed, we
2020.
did. Yeah. So I think that China will be a priority on the whole. And I think the broader goal here with China from Modi will be to strengthen India's capacity to deter China's power, and particularly when that power directly threatens India. I mean, India has not been able to stop China from staging incursions over the disputed border. And I'm sure that his coalition partners will be perfectly behind him as he figures out how to deal with that issue. But there is a disconnect in that Modi has basically said that we need to focus on the border. We need to get the border right. So that'll be something he'll want to work on in his third term. But the Chinese government has said, well, we're willing to look beyond the border. We want to see how we can make this relationship work, even if the border remains an issue. But that's not how Modi feels about things. So it'll be interesting to see how he works through that issue.
Do you see the new parliamentary makeup in India as in any way impacting or restraining what had been rather paranoid decision making towards dissidents abroad? We saw this assassination of a Sikh leader in Canada. We've seen accusations by the United States that India is targeting people in the United States who are basically dissidents. And it's all, just first of all, it's very just like audacious. Second of all, it's just like very risky behavior seemingly by
Mhm.
Modi. Will any of that be restrained in any way going forward, or will this new parliamentary makeup have no impact one way or another on that?
That is a big question. I think that for several years there's been growing concern in Western capitals about some of the internal developments in India, particularly those that relate to democracy. But I think that they could be accepted by Western capitals because, okay, this is a little troubling, but this is not something that directly impacts us. But then, indeed, when you have these allegations against the Indian government of being involved in these extrajudicial killings or attempted extrajudicial killings in Canada and the US, well, that's when what's happening in India is suddenly becomes very concerning because it's essentially repression at home becoming transnational repression abroad, playing out on the soil of Western countries. So it's hard to say. Most of these coalition partners are not what one could describe as hardline ideological type parties in the way that one could describe the BJP, quite frankly. And I'm not sure if they would be comfortable with India carrying these types of things out. But this is the type of thing, quite frankly, if not saying that the Indian government would try to carry out another transnational killing if we believe that the allegations are true of the previous ones. But, honestly, I think if Modi decided that he had to do this and he just wanted to do it, I don't necessarily think this is the type of thing that
Yeah.
he would want to negotiate with the partners. He would just basically say, this is an issue of national security. We're going to do this.
That's sort of my sense as well.
Yeah, exactly. It's a risk by doing that because even if these are junior coalition partners, if they get upset and if they decide they don't want to be a part of the government, well, then you got a crisis. That could be a risk for Modi if he decides to go that way.
Well, Michael, as always, thank you so much. This was very timely and helpful.
My pleasure. Always happy to join you, Mark.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.